Hello, Matthew and Michael. So great to have you guys here again today.
Hey, Karen.
I hear that you two have been talking offline about Barfield and some other interesting topics of reflection on language and meaning. And I thought maybe I would let the two of you kind of start off on where you're at so that I can figure out where you're at, and then I'll join in where I can.
You want to take the lead on that, Matt?
Sure. By the way, thank you, Karen, for having me back. And Michael, thank you for the conversation. It's great to see both of you again. Let's see. Well, Michael and I were, for months, ever since Michael and I met, I brought up a poem by Alfred Lloyd Tennyson to him called Ulysses, where he talks of, there's a part in the poem where he says, "All experience is an arch wherethrough gleams that untraveled world, whose margin fades forever and forever when I move." That has taken me for years in its ken or purview. And then when I met Michael and recited that poem to him under the, maybe you remember that, maybe you don't, but I recited that poem to you extemporaneously. You then brought up the concept of technical debt. And tried to work into my mind.
So debt, technical death or debt?
DEBT.
Okay, debt, okay.
Roughly the idea that in every step along an argument or a word chosen in a line of a poem, there is a trade-off because you're operating by inclusion, exclusion principles, right? For one word you choose, you're not choosing all the other possible words in the language or its synonyms with its nuances. So too, when you're writing code, you're giving up so many things. And that's a cost which has to be dealt with, but it doesn't have to be dealt with now. It can be dealt with much later, much later in the relationship of the technology to the user, the interface, software, and you can hide it too, which is an interesting property. You can hide the mistake with other mistakes. And this really got me thinking about the history of language, the history of thought by extension, and how we read the Bible, how we read classics, how we talk about canon. And Michael and I have been mediating this anxiety together through luminous figures, one of them being Owen Barfield and his poetic diction. And possibly in Barfield, the major observation that there is contradiction in the world, but not only contradiction. There is also polar opposites, which do not seem to require negation and therefore may not have a trade-off or debt in its logic, and this logic being a logic of communication. So we really vacillated back and forth between that in using different people, different words. That's what I've gotten out of it, Michael. How would you phrase things?
Yeah, the issue of technical debt, I think, is really interesting because in some ways it's just another way of elaborating, the observation Peterson makes about kind of how culture itself is always kind of dead and dying. But one of the interesting things as it relates to technology is that technology has this sort of eternal quality to it, so that it doesn't have the sort of natural tendencies to die in quite the same ways. And so, as you pointed out, you can, because of its kind of artificiality, you kind of can layer on layer on layer of these sort of patch fixes, and you don't have the ultimate death and rebirth that you get. For instance, I'm about to be a father. And so in some sense, one of the processes that's going to happen in there is that I'm going to try to pass on kind of my understanding of culture, tradition, et cetera. But it's going to be coming into this new form. And so there's a sort of death of me, but there'll be kind of a rebirth of me in a kind of a different form. And we don't really get that with technology. There's kind of, and I don't know that that's something people have thought about deeply, but it certainly is playing some sort of role in terms of kind of, I think maybe our inability to kind of, because, as we were talking earlier in our conversation offline, it's very obvious we're coming kind of to the end of something. but it seems like rather than kind of reaching that end, we kind of just seem to, it just seems to be going on and on sort of artificially, where it becomes more and more absurd. The sorts of, I don't know, the how far we can get away from things that seem to make sense to us all. And yeah, and I wonder to what degree technology is playing a role in extenuating that kind of this death taking such a much a longer time. And getting back into Barfield, I'm reading his History in English Words, and he makes the observation that, you know, that back in time, you know, languages changed fairly rapidly. You know, people are moving around. They can only keep so much in their head, and it's these cultures are primarily oral, and so they're trading words back and forth with other, and those words are changing as the culture changes, and this is happening rather rapidly. And then you introduce writing, and that kind of starts to slow things down some more. And then the printing press represents this huge change in terms of kind of freezing language so that it doesn't have this kind of capacity to update itself as quickly. And now, you know, maybe technology today is even a further kind of freezing of our sense making apparatus, so that it's updating at a slower pace in some ways, which is funny because we often think about how the ways in which technology is this sort of I don't know, like we're like just rapidly making progress and so forth, but I don't know. Anyway, that's kind of was where that line of thinking, the rabbit hole, took me down.
So can I jump in here, guys, for a second?
Yeah.
Okay, so if there's two things I wanted to bring up. One related to what Matt was saying, and one related to what you were just talking about here, Michael. So I'll start with you first, Michael. When you talk about, like, as a father passing on your culture, and then a part of you is dying, but then being reborn in this little person, but then also being changed. And that made me think of the discussion you were having with Fuccia about non-identical repetition, which I thought was such an important concept, this idea that, and so I'm wondering if it's only in living things, or if it's only in created things that occurs, this non-identical repetition, and perhaps in technology, because
within Fuchsia, yeah, who he's quoting is actually Kierkegaard, who has some famous phrasing of this, in terms of that this non-identical repetition is actually a form of transcendence. It's actually a manifestation of God in the real world, versus and that's contrasted with a sort of mimetic repetition, which is just a sort of copying. And in some sense, that's what our formal logic leads us to, like this sort of overly formalization, this attempt to kind of boil and distill all the world down into something that can fit within our tiny little skulls, because that makes us feel very powerful. And actually it is very useful and powerful. And as we've shown in the 20th century, creating things like the atomic bomb and such, there is that distillation is incredibly powerful, but it's incredibly deceptive too. Whereas there is this sort of this plenitude in this non-identical repetition, where, you know, and that it is a sort of manifestation of all reality, in terms of, you know, what I think in our conversation with Michael Fuchsia, he was pointing out, you know, the way in which a tree has this sort of treeness to it, and yet it's dissimilar and unlike any other tree. It is itself. It is a repetition of that pattern, but it is different. And this seems to be the ways in which God manifests himself in the world. That it's this sort of interplay between, you know, the form and the substance.
Well, another example you used was like in the human being, we're constantly changing because our cells are constantly dying off, and then we're getting new cells. So the person I am today is not at all, I'm not the same Hulk that I was a year ago,
Yeah.
right? But I'm the same person. So
Right.
the identity is identical, but it's a non-identical repetition. But that goes down through everything. I mean, in my mind, it also goes down through like all the physical laws and all the mathematical laws and all of those things. Anything that we could think of as being transcendent, as you were saying. It's just kind of mind-blowing once I started thinking about it.
Well, and this gets to the point too of what a person is, which me and Matt were also talking about earlier, which is you aren't those physical things, right? Which the materialist would try to boil things down to those molecules that make you up. But as you pointed out, those molecules are changing and so rapidly. You're eating things, like they're being incorporated into your body, like you're like who you are, like in your skin is sloughing off, and everything's changing. And so what you really are is what's consistent or constant, and even this part of you is changing over time, is you this sum of relationships, both internally and externally, like in terms of how all your parts relate to each other and interact with each other. And those are all like in these sort of hierarchical patterns, and yet those are changing over time too. And so it's very interesting to think about, how this all plays out in terms of the age to come and what, yeah, I don't know. Sorry.
Well, so let me take that and jump back to what Matt was saying about technical debt and the trade-offs and the inclusion and exclusion. And it's so funny how the mind works, because I had never thought of that in terms of poetry or in terms of language use, but it's completely true in terms of painting, art, that graphic arts and so forth, because you can start out with an idea, but every choice you make from then on is limiting that idea. And now you've limited the scope of the idea, you've limited the directions that you can go. With every subsequent stroke, every color you choose is a color that you can't choose. And it all comes down to this big principle of economics and of everything else in the world of opportunity cost, because every single choice that you make has a cost. And this idea that you can hide one mistake with other mistakes is, we do that all the time. It's an amazing thing. But I wanted to kind of fold all this in. I'm going to show you guys a little video, and then from that video, I want to move back out again into these ideas. I don't know if you've seen this. It's been making its way around the internet. I'm going to share screen here. And can you see that?
Yeah.
Okay, here we go. So I don't know how that strikes you, but when I looked at that, I just thought, we have no idea what it means to be human.
Mm-hmm.
What it mean, what memory means, and what so here's an Alzheimer's patient who all those synapses have been destroyed, right? And still, in spite of those synapses being gone, that artistic memory is alive. Anyway, I just throw that out there for you guys to throw.
We were just talking about this too earlier, about how we tend to see persons and cognition as this sort of thing that takes place in the human brain. That's where we see the kind of the locus of activity and where all the important stuff is, and the idea that like someday we'll figure out a way, like Elon Musk, to he's got this brain tech interface that he's hoping to develop, and we'll just be able to kind of upload the important bits into like the cloud, and we'll exist forever there. But definitely that's like a clear illustration to what a lot of people have, I think, long supposed, and even the ancients knew in a more direct way, that we seem to have lost, just the way in which cognition and memory and personhood is distributed throughout the whole body. That you, in some sense, you can't conceive of a person absent the whole body. That there's some deep patterned relationship amongst all of it,
Well, and also the interrelationship with other human beings, because it wasn't until he took her hand and made connection with her that the music awoke that in her. I don't know if you noticed that right at the beginning. She had started and then given up, and he reached out and took her hand and kissed her hand, and it just came alive in her. So it was the relationship with the body, but also the interrelationship with the other person. So Matt, does that spring anything for you?
Oh yeah, many things. The conjunction and juxtaposition at the same time. A lot of people have thought about this in a lot of different ways. One thing I want to do and note or earmark is, I think it's common to think of the Gospels as a biography. And so the line of direct interpretation is to follow Jesus, right? See where the hero's going, track him. He doesn't have an arc in the sense of Breaking Bad, devolution or an evolution into something better. This is just tracking the hero of heroes from the beginning to the end. And when he stops doing what he's doing because he's done everything on earth, then we stop too. But I think that's a very impoverished way of reading a meta-narrative or a totality, or of seeing part and whole relationships, especially to get after what's going on with that beautiful woman when her virtue is summoned, right? You were speaking of memory. Did she know? Did she stop herself and consult with her cogito as a good Descartian? Oh, I am thinking, and yes, I will continue remembering all that I have learned throughout my past. No, part of what brought a tragic tear to my eye was the recognition scene that she was possessed by herself. Her virtue was summoned forth in the same way that Lazarus was told to come out of the grave, and his virtue in the form of vital life came out. But note, just as with the Gospels, resurrection is always at the end. It's not in the middle, and it's not the principal thing. Before Jesus said, come out, just as the man touched the elderly woman's hand, virtue, come out, we have all this digression. Hey, Jesus, he's dead. Oh, we'll stay a few days. Let's go talk to the woman, but first the first woman, way far from the house. Oh yeah, go get your sister. Come on, can't we hurry things up to the tragic conclusion? I want to feel pity and fear as Aristotle said in his Poetics, which I've been obsessing over lately, in the same way that I did the P versus NP for so many years, he said, of all dramatic representation, the best is tragedy, because it's better than the episodic, it's better than the meta-narrative, because you have a clarification in the same way that an icon clarifies all pictorial diagrams. You have a clarification of the human character responding to human character under duress. And it purifies all your emotions, all your anxieties, all your neuroses into clarified pity for someone who made an error and they couldn't help it. They drank one bottle. They didn't know they were predisposed to alcoholism. But, you know, they shouldn't have been out that late. They made a little error and it turned out destroying their marriage, destroying their future prospects, and ending in obscurity. We feel pity at that. And if some philosopher comes in and says, go grab your sister. Oh, now let's talk for a while. Let's talk about the scriptures. Let's talk about it. It's like, come on, get to the point. I want to clarify the pity. Or if it's someone exactly like us and they're ravaged by some animal or some bomb destroys them, or they're sheltered in place, or they didn't win an election, we say, man, I'm fearful because that could happen to me. Aristotle thought we should clarify that. But the whole scope of what seems to matter across time, vast stretches of time, is this sort of thing that happens in the gospel where the thing we should care about, that Jesus says, summoning his virtue, come out of the tomb. Like, we're supposed to care about that the most, but it's given the least attention in the story. It's a very small proportion of the story. The rest of the story is a bunch of relationships that happen without some whole top-down conclusion that brings all the parts into a harmonious relation. We're left thinking, why were we given all that detail along the way? And then why does Jesus start crying?
Yeah.
As if he was surprised. And then when he's not surprised, and I'll end with this, he goes to the tomb and it has this moment where it says he snuffed out anger like a storm from his nostrils. And you get this impression of him as a dragon in the original Greek. It's wild and it's weird, and it makes you think of the dark cloud on the mountain in Exodus when God's giving the commandments to Moses. It's so weird, and it's never explained. And then he says, come out. And he comes out, story's over. Do all the parts relate as Michael was talking about? Or is this such a technical debt with error upon error upon error that it's just like, and Peterson said, why didn't someone come along and make this an ideology and just clean up all the mess and said, Jesus is the resurrection and the life? Why didn't we just make a haiku, one line of it? Who knows? So those are my thoughts.
I find that the weeping very interesting too in that story. Yeah, he is, you know, he is the image of the uncreated God, and yet here he is crying, and in some sense he has to know what's coming next, and yet he's so moved that it's so strange because, right, you know, other portions of scripture he kind of seems to give the disciples a hard time for their being overcome by their emotions and being like, oh, don't you know I am the resurrection and life, don't worry about it, you know, like, you know, don't you get that your Father loves you, and, you know, don't be sober. But something transpires here that is very interesting, you know, and what is moving him here. I had a situation this week where a friend of mine, this guy who's part of the men's group I'm a part of, he sent a text to our men's group and said, you know, he'd had this experience this week where he was with one of his friends, or one of his friends had his 6-month-old was unresponsive. They took him to the hospital, and he went with him, met him at the hospital, and was there when they gave him the news that his child was dead. And just how that kind of just ruptured something for him in terms of his ability to, you know, he was just confessing to us, you know, as in the group, that, you know, this is just, how do I deal with this? And now he's going to be one of the ones speaking at the funeral, and it's just a very hard thing, you know. And it's like, and then it just comes into the point of what we've been talking about too, in terms of like, this seems to be the thing that really troubles us in the frame we're in today, is in the stumbling block for why we struggle to believe, is this problem of evil. And I think there is some sort of answer in this, in terms of, I can't necessarily say what it is, but the reason we have all this extraneous detail, as you were pointing out, Matthew, is to illuminate some of that somehow it is a part of the story. It is not a sort of, there is this element of error and mistake, but there's also this sort of the opposite side of that error and mistake, which is this sort of redemption, this pulling it up into something larger. That's also happening at the same time. And so that in some sense you can't extricate the suffering from the joy in the resurrection. You add, the two are intertwined in a way that it doesn't make sense fully to talk about one without the other. And I'm not sure exactly what that is, but it's something I definitely have had sort of kind of, I would say, I don't know, mystical experiences that kind of point in that direction. And yet I don't really have the language to tease it apart. And yet I feel like it's hinted at in all these places.
Yeah. Did you want to add something, Matthew, before I say something?
Sure. Just a small remark on the use of mystical in your tying together of things, Michael. I think it's interesting when the mystical enters in a person's thinking out loud, or in a person's self-representations to self. And I think the monologue is a very interesting phenomenon. People pay good money to watch people think. Right? You go to a play and you watch people think out loud what they're going to do next and weigh the pros and cons of some contingent action. Is it a far, far greater thing that I do now than I've ever done before? Like, we would love to hear someone actually go through the next steps of that. And I don't know why, but we do it. And some great narratives are, like Charles Dickens's, are premised on it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. So and I think we implicitly recognize that the middle is much better than the beginning or the end. We love watching other people in dire extremes, and we also love watching people work themselves out of some impasse. And I think there is something of the tragic imitation and emotion, and it is a kind of education. It's an education of the sentiments. It's an education of how to orient all the different emotions that go on, which one to subordinate, which ones to make a priority. I think that's how people develop courage. And it's certainly how hierarchical relations are established and promulgated, like the military. You learn who your enemy is. You're put in virtual situations where you will be in combat. In very many ways, the best tragedy and the best comedy are preparations for the worst of times and the best of times. Children play with dolls before they have families. And in some way, I think what I try to do in my particular use of narrative is, or what I'm trying to do, is not write or think or speak to a formula that I think I'm supposed to. I did that in my early 20s when I was deep in Baptist theology, thinking that God is sovereign and all I have to do is align all my atoms to what he's already aligned them to do, which is basically to give up thinking, because my consciousness is original sin. That's pretty much what I did with that sort of theology. But instead to literally expose the contingency of the fact that I have no idea what I'm doing, and I know that, and yet the world has arranged itself and routinized itself thanks to all the work of tradition. And so we have to be in a walled city, and yet we also have to find out that we are the center of the divine action. And that's impossible. It's an impossible task. And so the Christian aspirationalism, I think, can come in and say, yeah, carry your cross up the hill, which is quite cruel. It is quite cruel. It's terrible. And finally, the reflection on John 3:16. Karen, I was thinking last night, I thought I knew what John 3:16 meant, And then I really took it apart string by string, line by line. It's a mess. It's a mess. Jesus is talking in a mess. He says, there were a bunch of serpents. Moses took up a serpent. Everyone looked at that. Okay, now I'm going to change my thought. Radical break. Now you got to think of Abraham and Isaac, like next second without any segue. God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son. Immediately they're thinking Abraham and Isaac because they're not 21st century Christians. Of course, they're going to think of Abraham and Isaac and the sacrifice. But it's so weird because he said God loved the world, not Abraham loved God, that he gave his only one son. That's why Jesus says the only begotten son. It's an allusion to give up your son, your only son, bring him to the mountain that I will show you. Why would you go from there are a bunch of serpents in Exodus that are giving the Israelites problems, Moses, here's some MacGyver solution, to the story of Abraham and Isaac? Never explained. And then Jesus just moves on. And yet it's something people put on bumper stickers and on t-shirts, and churches are built on it. And I do feel warmed by it, but I think it's an illegitimate warmth. It is such a weird, improbable, error-ridden string of words, a string of sentences. They're non sequiturs, but like I dare not change it. And I don't want to end up in creedalism where I just repeat after the priest, but I also don't know how to think through it. And I think trying to think through it has already been tried, right, in the 20th century. The scientific frame would be to say, oh, Matthew, there is a connection between the serpents in Exodus and Abraham and Isaac. You just don't see it yet. You don't have the right equipment. We haven't freezed the frame, to use Michael's phrase. We don't have the correct historical, grammatical, hermeneutic. But once you get all that, you'll see what was already there. I think that's like saying there's an invisible substance in the air. Like we just don't have proper magnifying glasses yet to see it. So anyway, I'm sorry, Kat. I thought I was going to just say like 5 words, but it turned out to be 50.
Well, that's okay. I did kind of lose track of what I was going to say, but you brought up something that has stuck with me for many years. We had the opportunity to spend some time in Venice back in 2006 and in 2008. And both times I was there, I went to the Accademia, which is the wonderful museum that's part of the city there. And in that museum, there is an amazing painting. I can't quite remember the title of it, but it's about the Bronze Serpent. And it's probably 60 feet wide. This painting is maybe 15 feet high and 60 feet wide. So you can't find a representation of the painting on the internet because it's just too big to capture. If they put it in a panorama, it would be a long, skinny painting like this, right? So you can't get the whole image of it unless you're there looking at it. When you're looking at it over, kind of in the sweet spot, you do see the scepter up there with the bronze serpent wrapped around it. But what you see on the main drag is all these people in the throes of combat with these serpents on the ground. These gigantic serpents wrapped around them. They're trying to protect their children from the serpents. The serpents are attacking. But what you see when you're looking at each person here is you can see it in the painting. I can't describe it exactly, but you can tell that what the artist was thinking was that each one of them is grappling with his own sin. He's not fighting a serpent, he's fighting with his own sin. And it's the most amazing piece of art I've ever seen. I mean, I was transfixed. And when I went back there 2 years later, I went again and I just stood there for half an hour transfixed by this painting. And I think that's the connection. Well, see, I have this theory that the existence of sin, which is pretty obvious to us, actually proves the existence of God. Not that God created sin, but the fact that there is sin. If you start spooling that out and think it through all the way through, you come to the inevitable conclusion that God must exist. And And that's all part of this whole issue of, you guys were discussing this issue of polarities and what is really involved there, that polarities are not the two opposites interpenetrating each other, but they're somehow that the two opposites are connected somehow in this middle ground, which is this great mystery. And I want to go back to what Michael was saying about this young man who observed his friend go through the death of his 6-month-old child. I struggle with this so often when something really tragic happens to someone that I know. I'm divided into two people. One part of me is off there in this theological world thinking, well, God is still sovereign. God is on the throne. He knows the answer to this. He has a reason for this. It's, there's going to be growth and beauty that's going to come out of this. And the other part of me is, here is a human person who is suffering deeply, and it's very hard for me to suffer along with them, because it's much easier to lay over here in the theological side and have all these answers so that I can separate myself from the pain. But over here in the human side, that's where it's important for me to weep with them. I think that's why Jesus was weeping at the tomb, was to illustrate for us that it is in the weeping with those who are in suffering that the true meaning somehow of that comes to us. The true meaning of it doesn't come to us on the theology side, although there's a lot of truth there. The truth is that all things will be redeemed, that he is in the process of redeeming. He's in the process of bringing the greatest beauty out of the greatest sorrow. But you can't say that to a person who's suffering, because it comes as an attack. I remember clearly when my husband left me and both of my parents were dying, and I was at church one Sunday, right in the middle of all of this death and sorrow and suffering, and my husband is gone. And one of the elders of the church came up to me and told me this wonderful story of another, of a leader in ministry who had gone off and left his wife, and she faithfully prayed for him for 14 years. And after 14 years, he surrendered his heart back to the Lord and gave up his life of pornography and prostitutes and all that kind of stuff. And he came back to her. And he's like, that's what it's going to be for you, Karen. Well, here I am. I'm in a completely different space. This was not helpful to me. Yeah, just pray for 14 years and it will all turn out okay. Now, maybe that was true. That might have been true. And maybe if I was a better person, I could have prayed for 14 years and my ex-husband would have come back to me. But at the moment, what I needed, I think, was somebody to weep with me. And the only thing that ever helped me during those times was knowing that the only person who could know what I was going through was Jesus, because he could weep with me. And all these other people only had answers.
A couple of things that made me think of. One that's so interesting. I find that when it comes to the problem of evil, it's always much, much more difficult in my personal experience to deal with other people's suffering than it is my own. Because and I say that, and I think about like what my friend experienced, and if I was that person, that was going through that would I be able to go through that and not be the sort of person that just, takes Job's wife's advice and just wants to curse God and die, and I don't know. But I do know that many of my own painful experiences have been, I can point back now as sort of transformational moments in terms of growth as an individual, but also just, I hate to use the word growth because it's so, that word's so captured by a certain frame that I'm not sure that's what I mean. But a sort of, I can't really think of a better word, but a sort of unfolding of who I am, and who, and that would not have taken place without those events. And so that's really clear to me. And so even though those memories are bittersweet, I can kind of see and make a sort of sentence of it, at least in the rear view. And we've talked about this before, Karen, how we obviously when you're going through it, it's so difficult, but you looking back at it, it's not the sort of thing you would go, oh, I'd like to wipe that out. Because in some sense, you realize that it's so, again, intertwined with certain ways of knowing and seeing the world now that you wouldn't want to part with for anything. And even for myself, in terms of coming back to faith, a lot of that, a big part of that was actually in terms of witnessing, in addition to my own tragedy, witnessing tragedy in another person's life, who was a friend who's actually a part of my men's group as well, and who became paralyzed from the neck down. And this is like at his, he's celebrating his engagement to get married. He has this tragedy occur, and I'd become his friend, like literally like maybe a month or month and a half before this took place. And it was such a strange event for me, because ordinarily that would have been something that would have just been a clear sign to me that, oh yeah, this God doesn't exist. How could something happen like this? Well, why, and yet I was really put through the ringer in terms of experiencing his suffering, but also having this undeniable certainty, which was weird because I'm such a skeptic. And I just, if I have a strong emotion of any kind, I tend to just kind of be like, well, how, this is probably because of something I ate, or some movie I saw, or some sort of idea in me that's kind of gone wild. But I had this sort of certainty about God's involvement in this, and his love for the individuals involved, in that he was in working of this. And so, yeah, I think this is, I don't know, this seems to be, for me, and it's still the sticking point now, like in terms of my own wanting to turn away. It's always this sort of problem as well, like of being like, well, I could believe if I was certain that God was good. I could wrestle with my sin in a more effective way if I knew that at the end it would be worth it. These sorts of things that come into my head, are still there, and yet, even this conversation, I can feel the back and forth, that wrestling with the snake.
Yep. I get that, wrestling with the snake. Matt, you look like you had something you wanted to add.
Yeah, if I could make a remark on that. By the way, did my sound go down, or is it the same?
No,
you're still good.
Okay, good, cool, thanks. So I think typologically, so I think through. Nietzsche said in The Birth of Tragedy that the poet, what distinguishes a poet from someone who doesn't have that particular sin of misunderstanding the world, the poet will take rhetorical figures for vicarious images. That's their particular problem. And
I saw that in your comments on the document, and I didn't understand that sentence. So could you before you move on from that, could you explain that sentence?
Well, I'll be honest with you. I have no idea what it means, but just like I didn't know what. Yeah.
Oh, I feel so much smarter now.
Yeah. I have no idea what it means, but in the same way that I have no idea what Kierkegaard did to me 10 years ago when I found Fear and Trembling in the library at South Dakota State University at 19 years of age. But yet that man has not let go of my neck for 10 years. He
Okay, so
traveled with me.
just repeat it then so that the rest of us can hear it one more time before we
Yeah,
move.
it's a beautiful line, and it came from Nietzsche when he was a very young man, like 20 something. This was his version of Maps of Meaning for Peterson, his very early work, his thesis, The Birth of Tragedy. He said, what distinguishes a poet from someone who's not a poet is they take rhetorical figures or vicarious images.
Okay,
And in many
I
ways,
get what he means by rhetorical figure. I think he means just like poetic language, right? For vicarious images, like placing yourself in that environment. Is that what it means by vicarious images?
I mean, it's so lovely, isn't it? Because it connects with so many things that are going on in the 21st century. Someone who receives a livelihood from Instagram as an influencer is making a livelihood based on the difference between rhetorical figures and vicarious images. Whereas a professor who writes learned letters and delivers learned lectures on the symbology of Paradise Lost is treating these vicarious images that kept a blind man very, very, very entertained with his own musings. Milton. He's treating this as rhetorical figures and giving us explanations as to why we should care, long after the fact of this blind man composing them in front of his daughters and family members. So one quick example is, and I don't want to make this all about the difference between it, but I honestly think it relates to that woman's virtue being summoned out of her Alzheimer's. For her, ballerina at that point in time was not a series of techniques. It was not a rhetorical figure to move the hand just so. In the same way, the movie The Joker, when he commits the killings and he wakes up, he's astonished at his own agency. And he goes into the bathroom, and what does he do with his hands? That gives a chill in the audience members. He does this little, like, his hand should be in the water, and he's making the ripple effect, which is exactly what it is. It's order and chaos. It's Peter walking on the water. It's the, oh my God, I'm astonished at my own. Let's get into it. And then he does that thing, and the violin goes on, and you have this moment of the rhetorical figures becoming vicarious images. And certain saints do this when they say that an icon chose them, and that's why they have to bring it into their house, because it's a person for them now. It's not a painting. They're deluded, maybe they're manic, maybe they're going through a phase where they're going to go on a long walk and get picked up by the police. I'm using these things because depending on your frame, you're going to interpret this person as crazy or as enlightened or as becoming educated. Because someone who's an undergraduate learning the textbook of, say, Hegel, by the time 8 years later when they have a PhD in Hegel, they sound different. They act as if they've met Hegel and they're friends with them. And they know their inner secrets. They know his biography, but also why he chose different things, why he chose to put the snakes of Exodus just before the Abraham-Isaac allusion in John 3:16. He acts as if he knows the person, which he doesn't. And so finally, like when someone says, oh, the sun got up this morning, as a rhetorical figure, we know, oh, that's an efficient use of language. You're saying that it is now a certain time of day, morning. But for a poet, they'll say in response, oh, then I should go out and meet him. Like we also smile at that and say, oh, that's witty of you. But Nietzsche thought there were some individuals who didn't say that ironically, but they actually thought they could go out and meet the sun because it got up and they got up. So there must be a imitation. And Christians do the same thing when they say, oh, I can imitate Christ, or I can try, or I can imitate a lesser saint. It's like, it's very much treating the proposition, you will know them by their fruit. Follow my disciple, you follow me. Okay, I understand you're trying to teach me the value of education. But for some people, they make that a life destiny. They take it as, oh, what you're telling me is there is such a being in the world that's greater than all the other beings, and he gave me a way to live so I could imitate him. Let me go meet him by going to this place on Sunday where he is not, but I'm going to act as if he is there somehow. It's just like saying, the sun got up this morning, and the poet's saying, oh, let me go out and meet him. It's very fine. It's a very fine movement. But it has something to do with summoning virtue and that woman's movement as a, as a ballerina.
Well, I love that example of going out to meet the sun, because that kind of illuminates for me Barfield's whole argument about language ultimately being that that objects are ultimately symbols. Did I get that right, Michael? I mean, is that a clear picture of an object being a symbol?
Yeah.
That for the ancients, they didn't see the sun as this scientific object that was a gas ball that had such and such a temperature and whatnot. They saw the sun as, another being that gets up in the morning that they could go out and have a relationship with during the day. They saw a tree as something that gave them shelter and brought them food and allowed them to, mark the seasons, and that every object was a symbol, was a meaningful relationship for them. Is that part of that middle voice thing?
I think so. Well, I mean, you think about it like, which version of the account of the sun has more information in it? The fact that it is, X million miles from the earth, that its temperature is at this, temperature, that it is, hydrogen that's going through this fusion process. Is there more information in that than the idea of this sun as this, dying and resurrecting God? It's difficult. It's very difficult to say. And it seems to me much more obvious given the fact that we descend from people that thought this way and were able to survive thinking this way, that there's probably a whole host of things in there that is much deeper. And it is a certain, it's like, well, that word symbol is so tricky because, in the modern frame, when you say symbol, what you really mean is only a symbol. Like you're kind of distinguishing it from reality as such. Whereas this symbol, in the way that Barfield used it, it's a portal to the greater, the real reality, which is this larger thing that is invisible. But this is kind of, every object is a sort of token on the playing board that gives you a sort of unique perspective, a unique handle to explore this deeper reality that is behind it. And so, and this wasn't a sort of intellectual exercise, right, that they were going through. It wasn't like they were getting up every day and be like, you guys, you got to believe this thing about the sun. This is really, you guys, I can show you, this is the way you should think about him. He's this God that dies, and he comes back every year, and we got to worship. Like, nobody was making, there was no like sort of apologist for this point of view. It was a sort of thing that was just felt, like you felt it. It was it had a deep inner life that was connected, where people felt not just a connection to the outer world, but also there was a sort of communal connection through each other to these ideas. And yeah, we've gotten so far away from it, it's difficult even to talk about it meaningfully. I feel like, when we do, we're still we have to use all these words which have changed their meaning so much that it's like it's difficult, to make any headway. But I'm currently reading a book by him. I think I mentioned earlier, History in English Words. That's really it's helpful in doing that. I think what it's mainly helpful at is in instilling a bit of humility about what sort of awesome power you're fooling around with when you're playing with words, and what you're invoking, the spirits that are at play when you work with these things, and that you should perhaps tread a little bit more lightly and should have a bit more humility in terms of what's going on there.
I think this connects with idolatry and worship and liturgy and passion. So in the YouTube video, one of the words in the title is passion. And Kierkegaard, famously to my mind, said in Fear and Trembling as a footnote, where he references Schelling and an offhanded comment Schelling made in some history of some figure. Actually, he was reciting a play, or excuse me, an opera, Schelling was. And he was talking on the stage was a woman sweeping the floor, and she was paid for by the family, the aristocratic family, and she was doing her job and she was doing it well, and she was maybe muttering to herself because she was having a conversation with God, or whatever her folk tale was, whatever her belief system was, which she was handed down to her by her mother or mother's mother. Anyway, she was doing her thing in the corner, sweeping up the crumbs on the floor of the aristocratic family. And they were doing their own thing and talking, and then one of the daughters or sons made an offhand remark that was kind of banal, but also kind of salacious, and everyone kind of giggled and laughed. And for some reason, they looked at the woman sweeping the floor, who overheard it. They could tell because her ears picked up, and she made a witty response. And Schelling said, of course, she wouldn't have known how to formulate the witty response. She wasn't in their circle. She didn't go to their academies. She didn't know the history of ideas. But in the situation given with the salacious / banal remark, anybody with ears to hear would have made a similar response because it was natural. It was a natural rejoinder. And what would be the explanation for that? Well, Schelling said, by the way, passion unites everything. That's why someone with no education sweeping the floor will make an appropriate witty response to something made by a king. Because passion unites, not the logos. Not something that can be put in a formula or set of terms and encoded, but passion unites mankind. Kierkegaard took out of that little remark his entire basis for saying that faith is a passion, and that's how we could understand Abraham's energy in taking his son up to Mount Moriah for 3 days, even though that was thousands of years away in a system of tribalism and ethics that we'll never be able to understand this side of the Enlightenment and French Revolution. Because with respect to that poetic way of thinking back then with the sacrificial system, we are the woman sweeping the floor. We babble in comparison. We don't have the categories necessary. The internet screwed us up. But by another way of looking at things, we are the aristocratic family compared to the nomad Abraham traveling with his son and being willing to sacrifice him. It's so primitive, we would say. So who are we? Are we the woman sweeping the floor or the aristocratic family? And the point is, we'll never be able to solve that problem. It's too hard. It's too hard. But fortunately, God made a way with non-identical repetition, the plenitude. The word Kierkegaard liked to use was passion. And I never understood why he was so gun-ho about passion. I thought he was using a Greek category. Ethos, pathos, and logos. He wasn't. He didn't know what he was doing. And I'm not saying I'm right here, but I'm discovering I'm having an insight in this conversation that it's what you were talking about, Michael. The plenitude of non-identical repetition, of the grandeur of mistakes, and how we all get to participate in that without dying forever. I mean, it must be the love of God. Okay, so now I'm starting to go into the platitudes, so I have to stop. But it's that moment of all those things.
Well, okay, so now you brought up something that makes, I've been having a lot of conversations with this physicist who's working on a theory about how the first life arose, a mathematical theory. And I don't know anything about physics, but I ask dumb questions, and sometimes my dumb questions cause people to think about things. So he likes to have me ask him dumb questions because it guides his thinking sometimes. I don't know. So anyway, in this discussion with him, I came upon this phrase, commensurability, incommensurability. And so I looked that up and I discovered this discussion of Thomas Kuhn, who was the guy who taught about paradigm shifts, when one paradigm becomes another paradigm. And scientific paradigms, particularly if you're trapped in a particular scientific paradigm, it's impossible to understand what someone else in another paradigm is thinking about. And Einstein, the only reason he managed to have his brilliant insight was that he stepped outside of the paradigm of the typical scientist of his day. And you know, here's the platitude, thinking outside the box. But here's a quote from this article about Thomas Kuhn. It's difficult to change the categories in one's mind because the groups have been learned by exemplars instead of definitions. This problem cannot be resolved by using a neutral language for communication, according to Kuhn, since the difference occurs prior to the application of language. The reason I got to thinking about that is we're in the middle of this gigantic political polarization in our country, where we have, like Scott Adams is always saying, two movies playing on the same screen. One whole category of people is going to see the world through a lens and it's going to look a certain way to them. And then the other side sees the world through a completely different lens. And they see the same actions through these two lenses and they come to startlingly different conclusions. But it's the same thing for scientists who are locked into a particular way of thinking. They can only see every experimental move that they make through the current lens, the consensus, so to speak. But the same thing happens with language. And here I thought that the particular thing about this quote that really got me was the groups have been learned by exemplar instead of definition. Looking at examples are much more personal. It's this analogous, it's this vicarious image, it's this thing that grips you rather than the Cartesian, cognitive definitions, rather than everything being logical. It's these exemplars, and they happen prior to the application of language. It's so visceral, right? So that's why you end up with the two movies on one screen, because people are operating out of this visceral space instead of a cognitive space. Does that make sense?
Definitely. And also, yeah, and because it's pre-language, we bring all those biases, that feeling, into the language itself in terms of how we use it and what words mean to us. Because the language is very tool-like, and one of the things that Barfield points out that is a consequence of of being highly literate is we have way more words than we've ever had before. And one of the consequences of that is that most of us don't really have a deep sense of what the words we're using actually mean. So you could see how we are just kind of set up to be rife with confusion, based on all this subconscious stuff that we almost in the modern frame almost deny that it's acting. We're kind of starting to get to the point where we're willing to recognize it, that it's acting through us. But then this sort of fiction of language is a sort of is this sort of concrete static thing that we can use to build formal systems with and build objective frameworks for understanding the world. Language simply doesn't function that way and never has.
And yet, I think it would be interesting in studying the history of the use of the word theoria, where we get the word theory, to reinterpret theology and the zoological or domestic sciences, the sciences of a house economy or a nation-state economy, or the economy of the angels and the Son of God and everyone's salvation, whether it's a universalized, all shall be saved, or particular because they made the right choices in this life, picking the correct frame over the incorrect frames, loving the good, hating the evil sort of thing. Language has this weird tendency to show up in all those places. Okay, so maybe everything's language. Well, I don't think everything is language. I think most people would say nothing is everything, and you can't say everything is the same thing, and you can't even say everything is nothing. There goes the Maya, everything is illusion, all that. But whether you're looking at a computer code, a game of chess, or a well-constructed plot, I think you're looking at the same thing. You're looking at a series of choices which not only tell you the story that's going on within that particular product or project, but it's also revealing its hand and showing you why it thinks it should exist, right? So you get a built-in ethic with an aesthetic. Okay, and then people try to go straight to the author and say, why did you construct this thing? What's your logos? What are you really after? And then I think a lot of people lose the beauty of the aesthetic, and they also are not disciplined enough to practice the ethical. They just want to go straight to, well, why'd you do it? Why, Jesus, why'd you raise up Lazarus, and how'd you do it? Well, that's just like asking in Tolstoy, why'd you write War and Peace? Just read War and Peace. Just follow Jesus through all his little involutions and digressions, because apparently that's what it is, and it thinks that justifies itself being there and then eventually resurrecting the dead. This relates to like horrible things in life, and I know that sounds very trite, so I'm not trying to make an argument for it, but I think in this regard, life can be looked at in two ways. Everything's an assembly of parts, so looking at the world as plotted is very useful. Also, to look at it as atoms is very useful, because there are parts in the whole, and the whole is comprised of parts. And so generally speaking, I'm fascinated by how Aristotle defined philosophy and tragedy. He said philosophy, the love of wisdom, is looking for, in all situations, causes and principles. So the foundation of something, and then the principle or motivation of its movement. In tragedy, which he thought was the most exalted form of representation, we get to, as audience members, watch something on a foundation. So a character, which is an abstract form of all human persons, tribes, people, and activities. On this foundation, a presupposed reality on stage, doing things and not doing other things. So the inclusion, exclusion, according to the plot, which we believe was made by someone who knows where to put the causes on what foundation. And that's a character's movement or journey. So Aristotle thought that was basically metaphysics, watching plays, and deciding, having the aesthetic judgment, what's a well-constructed plot versus a not well-constructed plot, was tantamount to saying what's the best possible world versus all the other crummy, lesser worlds that we need to be saved out of. And so there's a lot at stake for Aristotle's use of the word plot and tragedy, his analysis of tragedy. But I think when you get into the Hebrew text and the New Testament, you're in a new horizon. You're not operating on the basis of tragic emotions according to causes and principles. I think instead what you get is a total focus on suffering. That is the destruction of structure and the restructuring amid the ruins. It looks like characters on a stage. We read the Gospel of John and we think we see the character of Jesus walking around amongst all these other lesser characters that just don't know how to get their acts together, human beings. Thank God for the incarnation. but we're not actually seeing a tragic representation. We think we are, but I don't think that's what it is. I think instead what it is it treats human beings as they are, as a series of mistakes. That's the given. We know we're not what we should be in Petersonian terms. So it lets us think we're watching a tragic performance, but in fact, what it's giving us with all its involutions, digressions, not doing things correctly or in the proper order, it's giving us an examination of suffering, which is not a character. And it has therefore no plot, but it makes us see. So that's, I think, why in Genesis, the whole play of the universe begins with God said, and then it was, and he saw that it was good. No explanation, just a bunch of actions, not motivated by character, not motivated by character. So that's how it doesn't become a banal theology. There's no mention of the motivation. Calvin might have wanted to say, it's all, God did it all for his glory. It's nowhere in the text. All we're given in the text is a bunch of stuff. And suffering. Adam let all of paradise go to hell. So we get destruction, paralysis, horrible things without explanation. But it looks like characters. And we want to think, oh God, the character will get in the other side of it. He'll learn something. He'll become better. No. Once Lazarus was summoned out of the tomb, the assumption, the shadow in that whole text is he's going to die again. And Jesus doesn't say, hey, I brought you back. Let me give you a little taste, a foretaste of the tree of life. No, he's just like, we'll hang out until you die again. And then they're like, when he's resurrected, he doesn't give any of the disciples a clear picture of what their resurrection will look like. He doesn't even promise them resurrection. This scares me to death. Nowhere that I found in the Gospels is there a promise of the resurrection. There's a promise of life that doesn't die, and there's a promise of judgment. Oh, damn it.
So we lost Matt there for a second. What Matt was talking about there, I think is such an interesting analysis that the narrative of Scripture doesn't lay out similar to the tragic narratives of fiction. And that's one of the reasons that I think it's so obvious that the Bible really is true, because it lays out according to reality rather than the narratives of fiction. But there is a structure, I think it's probably in the New Testament as well. Well, it is, we see it, you see it through the whole arc of the entire Scripture. In fact, my husband noticed this the other day when he was teaching from the second chapter of Acts. But it also shows up in some of the poetic diction of the Old Testament, this chiastic structure. I think I've talked about chiastic structure before. It shows up in some of the poetry of the Old Testament, but it also shows up in the big narratives of the Old Testament. And Joseph's life is the clearest example that I can think of, where he starts out with these dreams of power and influence, and then little by little his world is narrowed until he's thrown in the prison, and he goes through this crucible of suffering, and then from there he moves out and out and out into more and more and more power and authority and influence. So you get this definite chiastic structure in the life of Joseph. You get the whole arc of it in the Scripture when you look at some of the passages in Genesis that are redeemed in the second chapter of Acts. The Tower of Babel disperses all the languages, and then in the second chapter of Acts, the languages are dispersed again, but they're dispersed in a redemptive manner. So there are these two ends that I think of them as like these polar opposites that Barfield was talking about, where it's this constant redemptive process that goes on between the two poles.
Yeah. I think there's some deep connection there between redemption and creation, um, where this is the sort of unfolding of reality. There's this great book by John Bear. I don't know if I've mentioned it to you before, called Becoming Human. It's a very little book. It's very short, and but one of the kind of I don't know, I guess the axioms or presuppositions of the book that it's trying to show throughout, from Scripture, is this idea that what God announces in Genesis. He says, "Let there be," for everything, except when he comes to humans, and that's when he says, "Let us make." And there isn't a sort of like, and even there, he doesn't make humans per se. He makes male and female. And it's interesting too that Jesus says in the resurrection there won't be male and female. So it seems like this is some sort of I don't know, temporary interlude that we're in right now. But he makes the case that this is God's sort of project that he undertakes, and what the story of Scripture is, this unfolding of his project to make humans, and that when Jesus on the cross says it is finished, in some sense what he's referencing there is this sort of project to create a human. And for me, one of the things that makes me think about is why is suffering necessary? And just even reflecting on my own experience, and I think I even said it earlier, there's a certain knowledge and wisdom you can't have without going through suffering. It's just like and I think in some sense, if our ultimate telos is to be united to God, there's something about our shape and structure in this process of becoming human that we're undergoing, that it seems like suffering and pain is just, it's a necessary part of it. That like there's not another way that it could be done. And I always think, I don't know why this has always struck me this way recently, but like whenever in Revelation, where all the saints are standing before God and saying, true and just are your judgments, there's a feeling I get there that's something of what they're referencing is, yes, I now understand why it had to take these paths, why you had to write the plot in this fashion, and that you did it to maximize this restoration of all things.
Wow. I really love that thought, Michael, that we are being shaped so that ultimately our shape will fit his shape, and his shape is a shape that is shaped through suffering ultimately. I mean, that's an amazing picture.
And I know this is something I've hammered on before, and certain people I don't disagree with, but I can't, I find myself unable to turn away from it, in terms of, I think it's very important that Jesus on the cross partakes in this suffering himself. But again, it feels to me like there's that is a reflection of the Father in a deep way, that it's not just a sort of one-time event, that there is some sort of suffering in the heart of God, that I don't know, that we are attached to by this. It's interesting. This other thing that's pointed out in this Becoming Human book is, if God had he makes the point that in dying the way he did on the cross, Jesus shows simultaneously what it is to be human and what it is to be God at the same time. And that if he had done it in any other way, it wouldn't be something necessarily we could aspire to. But because we all are going to die, we're all on this path towards death. It's something we can't avoid. It's common to every human. that this lays open to us all a path towards unity with him. And I think there's something there that is really, really deep in that. The why death is the means of unlocking life. I mean, we see it played out in all these patterns mythologically, through the eons. And I think we're so distant from those things. They're kind of just funny stories to us. They're just weird little patterns. But I don't know. There's something there that I think potentially, if we understood our ancestors better, they could probably teach us about this.
Well, I think it's that's one of the great things about looking at Barfield's work, is it does make us try to step back in time and understand what it was that our ancient ancestors, how they were perceiving the world, and how we can kind of enter into their world and perceive it. I'm going to finish up. I think we have to finish up here probably because we're at an hour and a half right now, but this is just a little anecdote. I was out walking with my daughter the other day, who's a millennial, and she said, how is it that, I think I had mentioned some kind of an herb or something. Oh, she had asked if I'd ever heard of valerian, and I said, well, yeah, I have. It is some sort of a sleeping remedy that's an herbal remedy. And she said, how did people ever figure out what herbs worked for what purpose? And that's a big question, How did the ancients know how to walk out into the forest and be drawn by certain herbs and begin to experiment with them? And, how did they survive that? That's a big question. But it put me in mind of this series of novels I used to read back in the day when I had more time and I read mystery novels. There was some historical mysteries about a monk named Cadfael who lived, I think, in the 13th century. And his job at the monastery, besides solving mysteries, was as the herbalist for the monastery. So he was the one that went out and gathered all the herbs, and they all have to be maintained in a certain way. They all have to be preserved in their own unique ways. This is, some of them had to be dried, some of them had to be preserved in oil, some of them were preserved in water. It just depended on the structure of the herb, and somehow they had figured all that out. They knew how to use it, what kind of healing properties they had. And that had to be because they had a different relationship with reality than we do. We don't look at things in the world as being useful to us that way anymore, because we've outsourced all of our needs to science and to pharmaceuticals and to supermarkets, and we don't have that same relationship.
Fuccia references in his book, we no longer look to the nature and have it tell us what it's useful for. We come in and go, oh, you're a tree, I'm going to make you into X, Y, and Z, because we colonize it rather than letting it colonize us.
Wow, that's a good way of putting it. Yeah. Well, maybe that's a good place to stop for now. We can continue on later. And I did get a text just now from Matthew that his phone died. So there goes technology for you. But this has been just a wide-ranging, very fascinating conversation, Michael. Thank you so much. And I was going back through your discussion with Fuccia, and you have a real gift for interviewing people. I think you should do more of those kinds of things.
Oh, thank you.
If there's other people you want to talk to and you don't want to start your own channel yet, feel free to use my channel and have your discussions with people. Certainly. Well, we're going to, Paul and Mike Fuccia and I are going to have a conversation next week at some point. So hopefully, wonderful. We'll be able to build on where we started with that initial conversation. Yeah, that was a good one. I'm going to reference it in the show notes for this one too. So, and so when is the baby due? Into January. End of January.
So we're in the third trimester.
It's gonna come faster than you can ever imagine.
Don't I know it?
Okay. Thank you so much, Michael. Have a great day.
Take care, Ann.
Bye.
Bye.